Good morning. I want to talk about sex. That's a good way for me to start off this thought for the week. The low-hanging fruit morally that the church often talks about is the LGBTQ plus agenda and the issues of gender surrounding sexuality. And certainly that's worth talking about, worth processing. It's certainly something that the church needs to, as we say here at Lifeline, draw hard lines on with soft landings for people who are struggling. And yet, we have a far more pervasive problem in American culture, in Western culture, even in the church culture. And it just has to do with the way that we have normalized heterosexual relationships, even outside of the bounds of marriage, and the way that sex is perceived and freely trafficked in outside the confines of marriage. It's simply become normative. It's become fully accepted. I want to read to you a couple of verses, share a couple of stats with you, and then I'm going to share something that I had written a number of years ago in response to a movie that came out that you'll be familiar with. This is 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. You're doing something that is deleterious to your own body and to your own self by engaging in sex outside of a given confine. What's the given confine? A few verses later in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband." In other words, marriage is a prescription for dealing with sexual immorality. Now, that doesn't mean that it takes away lustful temptation. It doesn't mean that it takes away what ends up being adulterous temptation. It doesn't mean that it takes away and sort of makes the sex drive monolithically focused on just your partner. But it does mean that it is the appropriate context for the sexual relationship. In society, we have some pretty significant issues at play when we think about stats in regard to sexual activity and its relationship to marriage or not to marriage. This is data from a 2002 survey. It indicated that by age 20, 75% of Americans had had premarital sex. By age 44, 95% of the respondents, men and women, had had premarital sex or sex outside the confines of marriage. What you learn from that is simply that it's completely normative. It's completely embraced. It's accepted, and it almost would be very odd for you to walk through life being celibate if you and refraining from sex if you were never married. Interestingly, sociologists have recently done some study about when couples cohabitate. Does it actually lead? Is it a proving ground that sort of leads to a successful marriage? This is some of the argument. I don't want to, just jump into marriage. So we're going to live together for a while. We'll be in that way sort of friends with benefits, if you will, and that will help us have like a little testing ground, a little proving ground, and then we, of course, can sort of cut our losses and move on if it doesn't work out. Two psychologists at Denver University did a representative sample of 1,600 Americans, Galena Rhodes and Scott Stanley. They did this representative survey of 1,600 Americans who were married for the first time between 2010 and 2019. The study found, listen close, the study found that 34% of marriages ended among those who lived together before being engaged, while just 23% of marriages ended among couples who waited until after the engagement or marriage to move in together. Now, I'm not advocating that when you get engaged, you should move in together. What I want you to see is that there's just a sociological phenomenon, and that is that the rate is almost 50% higher of divorce for a couple who gets in bed together and cohabitates before they're making a serious, ultimately kind of a financial, emerging of life commitment like marriage. Here even like engagement, but particularly focused on marriage. What that tells us is that God's way actually is the best way, and that it's provable even on empirical grounds that waiting would be better than indulging. But we live in a society that is deeply committed to the exercise of our sexual liberties. A number of years ago, Hollywood had a film that was based upon a book, and it was famous, right? It spun out other movies as well, sequels and so forth, but 50 Shades of Grey. And it was a movie about illicit sexuality and completely provocative, even kind of deviant forms of sexuality and sexual expression between a man and a woman. Lots of people took that in, of all different kinds, took it in and saw it as this sort of expression of the sexual self. The movie worldwide grossed a little over $500 million. It took $40 million to make, and it grossed over $500 million. The author made around $50 million from that first book. At the time, I wrote a little piece, and I'm not even sure I've shared it with anybody. And I thought, well, I'll use a thought for the day, thought for the week rather, to share that. And so it was, here's what it was titled, and I think it applies to this issue of rampant sexuality and how we need to see sex, even heterosexual sex, as being within the confines of marriage as God desires us to utilize that wonderful gift that He's given us. So I wrote 10 black and white principles for a world with 50 shades of gray. 10 black and white principles for a world with 50 shades of gray. And I'm just going to read them for you. Number 1, the human body is the Lord's. That's the first principle, the acknowledgement of ownership. The human body is the Lord's. 2, the human body is the Lord's for His purposes. He gets to say, I don't get to say. Number 3, the treatment of the body impacts the condition of the soul. That is to say that I don't do things to my body without an impact to my inner life and my immaterial being. It marks me. It shapes me. Number 4, the condition of the soul demonstrates itself often in how we use our bodies. If I feel that I can just be a sexual libertarian and I am my own, I'm self-autonomous and no one can put constraints on me, and I should not be fenced in by the archaic notions of some type of Luddite puritanical morality such as sex being expressed in monogamous marriage, then I'm saying something actually about the condition of my soul, namely that I'll do what I want, when I want, with whom I want. And no one will tell me otherwise. And such independence bleeds over into other areas of my life and demonstrates my lack of teachability and my inability to submit to the will of any higher authority. Number 5, sex is the physical expression of soulish love, which is designed to operate in another's best interest. That is that when we say the words, we had sex, we made love, that's a odd thing to say. You could easily have sex without making love, because love is when I'm operating in another's best interest. You certainly can use sex in the right way in the confines of marriage and make love, but that doesn't mean you're always making love when you have sex. You may come to the marriage bed even and be a taker, not a giver. That's not making love. That's being selfish. And if you are indulging in sex outside the context of marriage, you're not making love. You're not operating in another's best interest. You're entering into a physical activity that's actually soul-destroying rather than soul-giving, as God, the author of your body and your soul, has expressed in his will. Number 6, pleasure is a gracious byproduct of sex, like sweet taste is a gracious byproduct of food. It's not the purpose of sex. You should understand that. It's not the purpose of it. It is a byproduct of it. Procreation is a purpose of it. Oneness is a purpose of it. Enjoyment is a gracious, wonderful, God-given byproduct of it. Number 7, reducing sex to personal or mutual thrill-seeking cheapens the gift and unhinges it from its design. Of course, sex is thrilling. That's not the point. The point is, if my engagement with sex is for the purpose of thrill-seeking, then I'm actually cheapening something. I'm saying what God has given in this beautiful gift should be unhinged from its design, and it should then be commodified for me in a thrill-seeking manner where I'm always seeking the next thrill, the next thrill, the next thrill, ad infinitum. Number 8, visual entertainment can be biblical or non-biblical, but should never be unbiblical. I'm going to say that one again. Visual entertainment can be biblical or non-biblical, but should never be unbiblical. So I can watch something that's non-biblical. That doesn't make it unbiblical, but there is entertainment that's unbiblical, runs against the themes of the Bible, and I need to be aware of that and abstain from that. Number 9, guilt over sexual sin is natural and is a necessary precursor to confession, which removes guilt. We live in a culture where we have this idea that if you feel guilty, something's wrong. Something's wrong if you feel false guilt. Proper guilt is a grace to you because it is God's kindness that leads you to repentance. And the sensation, the experience of guilt is a kindness that lets you know that you need to flee to the gospel. And finally, number 10, the gospel of Christ speaks into the bedroom too. It speaks into it in multiple ways. First, it speaks in and tells us that the marriage bed is undefiled. That's the place where sex can find its ultimate expression as a unifying tool of intimacy. Secondly, it speaks to the idea that you're to be a giver and you're not to be a taker. The gospel is about giving, not about taking. The third, it's a place where in that relational intimacy, I can let go of resentment, I can let go of pride, I can live in vulnerability towards someone else because I know what it means because of the gospel to live in a kind of vulnerability. Because in one sense, I'm really entrusting myself to God. I learn that the gospel of Christ that speaks over all of my life speaks over my sexual ethic as well. And a fourth thing is it speaks into the bedroom even of people who are cohabiting, who confess the name of Christ. And it speaks into that and says there's a discord, there's a disconnect here. You're taking from something and someone rather than giving to that someone. And your confessional statements about honoring the Lord with your body and your soul are not matching what you're actually doing. There's a problem in your belief structure. So what's the answer for all that? Well, the answer is repentance, which leads to alignment, which leads then to celebration of the good gift of God, namely sex for the context and confines of sweet, monogamous, marital, heterosexual union. May the Lord bless you today.